The failure of the Democrats and Kamala is much more important than the election of Trump. But I have high hopes for Trump himself because he is angry at this point at the state, the deep state, I should say, in particular, and he's going to do his best to unwind it and abolish it. So I'm cautiously optimistic, even though before Biden leaves office, he may yet start World War III with Russia, or may attack Iran or provoke the Chinese. Yeah, it's a dangerous time. Not to mention that the markets are all very overpriced and the deficits are going to get bigger. Yeah, it's a dog's breakfast. By all conventional metrics, the stock market, which is at all-time highs, of course, is price-earnings ratio, price-to-book value ratio, dividend yields, quite overpriced. And in the meantime, actual numbers of employed people are going down. The amount of debt in the country is gigantic and growing. It seems like more than ever, people are living off their credit cards and doing so at 18 or 20% or whatever it is interest. A lot of auto loans going into default. People are still idiotically paying tens of thousands of dollars to go to college on borrowed money and be indoctrinated with Marxist concepts. It's kind of an ugly picture. And I've been saying for a long time that what we're entering upon is something I call the Greater Depression. Much of the world, in particular the Western world, in particularly the US and Canada, have been living above their means for a long time. And the way they've done this is by borrowing money. It's like if you or I borrowed $1 million right now, we could live very high off the hog for the next year, but an artificial rise in our standard of living. But it's going to be a very real decrease in our standard of living when we have to pay the $1 million back. That's what all the debt in the world is about. Well, he's talking about tariffs that are much, much greater than anything we've seen in the past. He's talking about across-the-board tariffs of 10 or 20%, and he's talking about punishing the Chinese with 50 or 60% tariffs. I mean, he's got all these arbitrary numbers. Let me go back a little bit further. The major export of the U.S. for the last 40 years hasn't been Boeings or soybeans. To start with, our major export has been dollars. Now there are, who knows, nobody knows, 30 or 40 trillion dollars outside the United States in the hands of foreigners. And unlike Americans who must use, by law, dollars to transact, foreigners don't have to. And I'm afraid the dollar is going to become a hot potato. We're seeing that with the BRICS talking about starting a new currency. If Trump puts on tariffs, trade internationally would collapse because people cannot afford to buy these things. And trade now is a much, much bigger factor in the world economy than it was in 1930 when Smoot-Hawley went into effect. So yeah, it's a potential catastrophe from that point of view. A lot of good things about what Trump is doing, but that is a very dumb thing. The reason why Americans buy things from all around the world is because the costs in America are too high. Why are the costs so high? Because we have an unbelievable morass of regulations that take costs to the moon, make the manufacture of a lot of things completely uneconomic. Point number one. Point number two, taxes in the U.S. are very high. And of course, you want to go to a lower tax jurisdiction to manufacturing things. So to solve the problem, you don't make the problem worse by putting on tariffs. You solve the problem by eliminating regulations and cutting taxes. But you can't really cut the taxes unless you cut your spending. So that's another thing that they should be doing. The U.S. government should radically pare back its intervention in the economy and its spending to make it possible to reduce costs here in the U.S. One thing that Trump has mentioned is he'd like to eliminate the income tax. That would be absolutely marvelous. The cost and the nuisance and the risks of filing income tax every year is catastrophic. The distortions that it causes in the U.S. economy. Yes, the income tax should be eliminated. People forget we didn't even have an income tax in the U.S. before 1913. So yes, that can be done. The only way you can do it, however, is that the government radically cuts its expenses. Agencies should be abolished wholesale. This program with Elon and Vivek, marvelous idea. But Most of these government agencies, they're looking at the Department of Education first and foremost, but we've got hundreds of them, and they should look at all of them. And it's not just the Department of Education that should be abolished. Most of these agencies should be abolished. They serve no useful purpose. And if you just cut back the number of employees and make them more efficient, when the Democrats are back in office, and they will be, if you fill the piggy bank, that'll allow them to spend a lot more money and hire back exactly the same people that you fired. It's like a plant. If you prune it, which is what they're planning on doing, it just causes it to grow back stronger and bigger. So no, you've got to root these agencies out. Trump said, we can't mess with Social Security. That's written in stone. Can't mess with Medicare. And of course, they can't do anything about the interest payments on the budget, which are now over $1 trillion. And the other thing he said is that we can't mess with the Department of Defense, which is one of the major sources of corruption. Now, these things put together add up to almost 90% of all government spending. Those are the biggest things right there that I just mentioned. And he doesn't want to cut them back. It's actually a hopeless task. But perhaps he can keep this thing going by cutting back regulations and cutting back taxes, by abolishing all these other agencies. Look, Social Security, it's counterproductive. I know many people rely on it, but a responsible person saves for his own retirement and doesn't rely on a Ponzi scheme. Social Security's assets are solely government debt. And there's an excellent chance that all government debt will be defaulted on. Medicare, your expenses are largely covered. If you're over 65, wait a minute, should we cover the expenses people have on their cars as well? I mean, a prudent person saves for his own retirement with Social Security, saves for his medical expenses. Why should somebody pay for somebody else's medical expenses? Should we pay for somebody else's house expenses? Should we pay for their education? Well, we do all that too, of course, directly or indirectly. And the Department of Defense could easily be pared back 75%. It's basically enriching the military companies as opposed to defending America. Actually, it's acting as a provocation to adversaries like China and Russia around the world, all this military spending. There are so many distortions that have been cranked into the economy where people are doing things that are uneconomic in reality, but they're doing them because they're artificially economic, because of regulations, tax distortions. Well, electric vehicles is one of many. So people that are working in these artificially supported industries are going to be unemployed. They can go out and find a new job, which shouldn't be that hard. Unemployment should not theoretically be a problem because everybody has an infinite desire for goods and services. Listen, I hope he pulls it off because right now, Washington and the U.S. government are controlled by actual Jacobins. These people have the same psychology, the same philosophy, the same economic and political beliefs as the Jacobins that came after the French Revolution did. So they've got to be rooted out. But you remember that when the Reaganites came into office in 1980, their theme song was, "If not us, who? If not now, when?" And it turned out it wasn't them and it wasn't then. The situation is much more serious now than it was under Reagan. People have forgotten totally that during the 19th century, we had hundreds of what beneficial societies. Remnants of it are the Kiwanis and the Lions and Rotary, and there's a few others. Most of them were local. They made it their business to make sure that people that had had hard luck were helped out, and they were monitored locally. If the person was skating and didn't deserve it, the benefits were cut off. But now welfare has become enfranchised. That should be abolished and replaced with the types of things that society had in the 19th century, which were all destroyed because of Roosevelt institutionalizing welfare and government intervention. It's not like gold is cheap anymore historically. It's not like it's at giveaway levels anymore from a historical point of view. But I think it's going higher because the BRICS, which equal more than half of the world's population, don't want to hold dollars. So how are they going to trade with each other if they're not going to use dollars? They don't want to hold their rupees and rubles and yuan. I mean, they don't trust each other. They don't want to use dollars. So what are they going to use? They're going to go back to gold. And that's why gold is going higher. The world runs on hydrocarbons. It's not going to run on windmills and solar collectors. Nothing wrong with them for unusual, special circumstances. I'm not opposed to them, but they're really stupid to try to use them to power a mass industrial society. And right now, the way to do it, as it has been for the last 100 and some years, is with hydrocarbons. And there's enough hydrocarbons left for several hundred years, believe it or not. But actually, nuclear should replace, we should be generating power with nuclear, which is the safest, the cheapest form. I think with fifth generation nuclear plants, which are the size of those used in nuclear submarines, for instance, which are being developed rapidly, there's going to be a big demand for uranium. And of course, in maybe 5, maybe 50 years, fusion power will come on board. So this hysteria to waste giant amounts of capital on solar and wind is actually an insane mania. Despite the fact that Trump wants to see a lot more drilling of oil and gas, that's going to reduce the prices of those things. But the use of oil and gas around the world has been increasing at a couple of % per year, and I think that's going to continue. I was a late adopter to Bitcoin. I only got into it in 2017. Why? Because Aristotle in the 4th century BC laid down the characteristics of a sound money. Bitcoin is durable, it's divisible, it's consistent, just like gold is. But I couldn't figure out, well, what's the use proposition? That's the fifth reason why gold is money. It's usable. And I thought, how is it usable? I mean, it's just a digit. And then I figured it out. It's a perfect transfer mechanism. It's a perfect privacy mechanism. It's easier to store. It's got a lot of advantages over gold from that point of view. And eventually, they'll be mining gold in the asteroids, which some of them have been determined to have gigantic, rich amounts of gold and silver and other heavy metals. So, gold is not going to be totally forever. But I think Bitcoin will be. I'm a Bitcoin bull, and it's going higher. A lot of governments are going to adopt Bitcoin as a temporary high-tech alternative, if you would, to gold and certainly to the US dollar, which is on its way to the graveyard. The U.S. government is running $3 trillion deficit every year, and that money is monetized. Nobody's buying the U.S. government's debt. In fact, foreign governments like the Chinese are selling it. It's a hot potato. So who can the government get to finance their debt? Well, they're mainly selling it to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve prints up money to pay for it. So the money supply is going to keep rising in the U.S. for that reason alone. So I'm not optimistic about the dollar. Sure, there's short-term fluctuations, but it's an IOU nothing on the part of a manifestly bankrupt government. Let's hope Trump can turn that around. But I think the situation's, at this point, too far gone. And the population of the U.S. has become too corrupted by getting freebies from the government. And the corporations are even worse than the general population.